Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers. I'm your host, Murray Darm. I'm the assistant editor of Ancient Warfare magazine, and as you can see, I am flying solo again. So in a moment, I'm going to answer one of our viewers' questions. You too can ask us a question if you like. You can become a supporter or a patron of the podcast on www.patreon.com/Ancient Warfare Podcast. You can choose one of three levels. I believe that we have the Legionary, the Optio, and the Centurion. And those levels come with a copy of the magazine either in print or in digital form if you want it. And of course, the Ancient Warfare Answers are the short format of the podcast that we're doing. So this is your weekly Ancient Warfare fix, if you like. They're 10 minutes long, and either I or Jasper or both of us will attempt to answer one of your questions. The other form we have, of course, is the big full panel of the Ancient Warfare podcast, which has me, Mike, Mark, Jasper, and Lindsay. So there's generally six of us who talk about Ancient Warfare, and of course hosted by the wonderful Angus. Now, the question I'm about to answer is from one of our viewers. He asks, or she maybe asks, what steps did ancient commanders take to ensure their army's logistics were in order? And this is one of those questions which tends to be invisible in our sources. It's not something that the ancient authors considered exciting to write about, and so it tends to be invisible. They don't mention it. It must have happened. They must have had to feed their armies. They must have had to drink water. They must have had to have planned how they were going to get where they wanted to go. But it tends to be something that is either accidentally mentioned in the sources or something that isn't mentioned at all. And so we're sort of just left to question, well, I'm not sure how that happened. So the exception to that is Julius Caesar's commentaries on the Gallic Wars and the Civil Wars. He, by contrast, goes into great detail about ensuring that he's got supplies into various towns and that he sends his troops to find food, to forage, to do that kind of activity. And so what you find is that that model tends to be extrapolated out for all ancient warfare, both centuries before Julius Caesar and centuries after Julius Caesar. It's the Julius Caesar effect, if you like. We do have some evidence, for instance, when the Persian army, which Herodotus tells us is 5 million men, which no one believes today, was coming from the Persian Empire to invade Greece, that they ensured that there were adequate supplies along the way, or that they had vassal kingdoms and vassal kings who were given that responsibility along the way as well. And of course, we have the evidence that that vast army on the march drank the river Oxus dry. So, you know, we do get occasional evidence that these things are happening, and the vast amounts of supplies that must have been necessary. Obviously, an ancient soldier probably couldn't carry too many days worth of food with them. We assume that they must have had camp followers who were doing baking, cooking whilst they marched, and you know they're ravaging the land as they go. They're taking provisions from the land that they're walking through. Generally, we're talking about invaders, so they're not buying it, you know, at reasonable prices. They're not negotiating with locals about, you know, taking some of your flock. They're just taking it all. And so, in that regard, you've got sort of the evidence of the denuding of an entire area of livestock. We tend to get that from the Gothic Hunnic invasions in the late 4th and 5th centuries AD, for instance, that they are ravaging all over the provinces of Thrace and Moesia, and, you know, they're taking everything. And so in that regard, it's very hard to sort of get any detail. we don't really have even reliable numbers. We're given one number by Eunapius, which is 200,000 Goths in 376, and so we're not sure if that's the entire nation or if that's the fighting force. And so if it's the entire nation, so if it's a nation of 200,000, you're dealing with 50% of them are women. Probably another 25 to 50% are elderly or young children. So, you've got an army, let's say, of between 50,000 and, say, 60, 75,000. And that other 125,000 is providing for them. So they are cooking, they are, probably they have brought livestock with them when they cross the Danube. We're not really shown. We're told some evidence of how they're extorted on the other side and, are being charged exorbitant prices by the Roman governors. And that's, of course, what leads them to revolt. So part of that, of course, the agreement with crossing into the Roman Empire in that case is that they would be looked after. They would be given land to farm. They would be given provisions. So the idea, of course, is that the Romans must have had those provisions in the towns and farms of that province to do that. So, all of that kind of movement of vast amounts of foodstuffs tends to be invisible. We get, I'm just thinking now, we do get some evidence in Belisarius's invasion of North Africa that he's bringing water amphorae with him from Constantinople and then landing in North Africa. And the reason we know that is Procopius includes an anecdote of how the water spoiled, except for the water that was in Belisarius's own ship that had some sort of special treatment from Belisarius's wife, and that therefore that water didn't spoil. So you do get sort of that idea that some of the foodstuffs that these armies had with them must have gone off and spoiled and been ruined and broken. And I mean, the other thing about Julius Caesar is, of course, that one of the things that's apparent in his Gallic wars especially, and also partially in the civil wars when it comes to Dyrrhachium, is that he seems to know exactly how far he can push his troops when they are not getting enough provisions or when they are being, starved or thirsty. So there's a kind of, I don't have to feed you a lavish meal. I'll get away with it if you've slightly underfed. Now, of course, you can't underfeed an army for very long and it remain effective. You have to provision it and feed it relatively well for it to operate effectively as an army. In Alexander, for instance, we don't get any real evidence of how he's provisioning his army as he goes. Similarly, with an army like the expedition of Cyrus in 401 BC, we're not really getting much there either. Most of the Greek warfare and other Roman warfare, they're fighting on home territory. So there are friendly towns to provision them where they are. Some of those towns get eaten out of house and home and drunk dry, but generally you're dealing with armies fighting within a relatively close distance to friendly territory. And that's one of the big contrasts with Alexander the Great's invasion of the Persian Empire and the Carthaginian invasion of Rome and Italy, for instance, where we're not given, as far as I can remember, any real evidence of laying in of provisions. They must have, they had elephants, we've talked about those, and how much they ate on a daily basis, and they would have to be fed. You can't have your elephants falling over starving. So in that regard, you've got all sorts of evidence of provisioning on the road. It must have happened, but it tends to be silent in the sources because it's not really very exciting. There's a couple of modern books written about the logistics and the logistics of the Macedonian army, the logistics of the Roman army, because it must have happened, but it's just something that tends to be invisible in our historical accounts. See you again next time.